Our first guest is Philip Wallach, and Philip is from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and as part of the Brookings Institution, we have you out here visiting our division, the Brookings Mountain West, and you've been here for a week. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a great time.
And this is your first time out in Las Vegas, is that right?
It's my first time as far west anywhere in the U.S.
Okay, and so you grew up in the East, you went to school in Princeton, and then you moved over to the Brookings. Right, and you're in the government studies?
Governance studies,
Government studies. And your area of expertise is on the bureaucracy and how bureaucracy interprets law and then creates regulation. Is that?
Yep.
Is that a fair interpretation?
The whole panoply of regulatory affairs.
Regulatory effects of this. And one of the questions, my first question, and then we'll get into some specific topical areas, is the question for me is how do the relationship between the legislature and the bureaucracy in terms of the bureaucracy taking the legislation, the law, and then maybe interpreting that and the intent of the law. How broad a scope is that for agencies?
Well, it's all going to depend on the language in the laws, and we have an awful lot of laws that are pretty vague, either because Congress intended them that way, because that sort of made it easier to compromise and get something passed, or because unintentionally Congress has anything but perfect foresight. So a lot of our very important statutes leave a lot of room for interpretation, and it's the executive branch and the bureaucrats in the agencies who are the ones making the primary interpretations.
Interpretation, and especially in environmental protection areas because of the technical issues. So that's one of the reasons why they made them purposely vague. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. They wanted to give the agency flexibility to sort of assimilate new science and deal with the challenges based on their expertise, and that gives the agencies a lot of flexibility. Okay,
and in particular, we've been looking at, or I think you've been looking at, is it the Clean Air Act, right?
Yep.
And in the Clean Air, of course, then we get into the whole issue of emissions and power plants and other kinds of areas. But I think you've been working on emissions, is that?
Well, yeah, I've been specifically looking at greenhouse gas emissions, which are different from other kinds of pollutant, right? Sulfur dioxide or nitrogen dioxide, those things make the air hard to breathe and make people sick. Carbon dioxide is different, right? We're worried about its effect on global climate change, but we're all breathing out carbon dioxide all the time, so it's not a pollutant in the same sense. But because of the flexibility under the Act, a lot of environmentalists wanted the EPA to use the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, and eventually they sued the agency and won that case called Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007 in the Supreme Court. So in the last 6 years, we've been sort of seeing how that plays out as the EPA tries to use the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases.
Wait a minute, they sued the EPA because the EPA wasn't being aggressive enough? Is that what you're saying?
That's right. The EPA's position was that the Clean Air Act wasn't very well suited to dealing with this problem of greenhouse gas emissions, which is effectively the same as energy usage for the whole economy. And so they sort of want to say, let's wait and see. We're not going to say one way or the other whether the Clean Air Act has to be applied. The environmentalists and their state allies sued and said, you don't have that flexibility. The statute requires you to go ahead and regulate, and they won.
Okay. So let me this is, I think, an interesting point. Often we complain about the federal bureaucracy and how they want to do all kinds of things to us, the individuals back here in the States. But in fact, in this situation, they were reluctant, right? And it was the states that said, you must do something.
Sure, and so it's a little ironic now when people claim that the EPA is usurping legislative authority and some sort of runaway agency, when in fact it was the courts that started them down this path.
Okay, and so they're now trying to regulate and more about these emissions. And where do these emissions come from that they're trying to regulate?
So one is from cars and trucks. They put out a regulation for that in 2010. It basically just involved ramping up the efficiency standards, those CAFE standards that all cars have to go. So over the next decade, cars are going to have to become a lot more fuel efficient. The other big thing is about new power plants and existing power plants. Those are two different issues. On the new power plants, the EPA has proposed a rule last year. It's still waiting to be finalized. and we're going to see whether they sort of have the courage of their convictions, or the court's convictions for that matter. But that would basically prevent new coal power plants from being built in this country.
It would prevent new ones.
More or less, until we got better carbon sequestration technology that was commercially viable.
Okay. Well, we only have a few minutes, and I want to talk about two things about this. One is the sequestration you're talking about is not the sequestration, let's be clear about that, right?
Different issue altogether, yeah.
Altogether. What we're talking about here is just controlling the emissions. But for us in Nevada, because we're worried about Nevada, this really probably doesn't have any impact on Nevada, right? Because we don't use coal burning.
Well, right. So Nevada has a very high percentage of its power generated by natural gas and by renewables like solar. So Nevada's in a pretty good position not to be too negatively impacted. But of course, you're drawing some of your power from the grid from the neighboring states. So what happens to coal power plants there will affect you.
Okay. Well, I've got to end here, but that's an important point that where we are in Nevada. And I want to thank you for coming on to the show. And hopefully we'll have you back here in Nevada again soon. And we can have you back on the show on the Urban Report. Let's